What would you do if you found evidence that something dark was happening within the church itself? I am Father Thomas Berry, and if you followed my last report, you know that I have discovered forbidden secrets that should never have been revealed. But what I found next was even more disturbing, because it's one thing to hear rumors about conspiracies and secret pacts, it's quite another to have proof of it in your own hands. Documents, records, testimonies, evidence that shows that within the church there is something that should not exist. And I need to share this with you before it's too late. We often imagine the church as a sacred refuge, a place of peace and devotion. But what happens when hidden forces infiltrate where we least expect it? What happens when men who are supposed to be spiritual guides become pawns in a game much darker than we can imagine? If you believe that faith and darkness cannot coexist, prepare to change your mind. For years I have heard whispers about secret societies within the hallowed walls, about deals made in the shadows, about priests and bishops who traded their divine mission for something terribly dangerous. But all of this seemed distant until a mysterious envelope arrived in my hands. Inside was the evidence. Ancient texts, signatures, commitments sealed with something that no Christian would dare name, pacts that don't just involve words, but sacrifices, documents that shouldn't exist, but that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is something terrible happening behind the altars. And when I started reading, I felt a weight on me, something that seemed to suffocate my soul, as if I were opening a door that should never be opened. But it was too late to turn back. What I discovered could change the way you view faith forever. It can shake your view of those who are supposed to protect the flock. Because we are not talking about simple moral deviations or financial scandals. We are talking about something much bigger, something that goes back to centuries of silence and manipulation. But before I continue, I need you to understand one thing. There are forces that don't want this story to come to light. Since I started following this trail, strange coincidences started to happen. Phone calls with no one on the other end, shadowy figures watching me from a distance, constant feeling of being followed. That means I'm on the right path. And if you want to know where this trail took me, if you're ready to see the evidence that so many tried to hide, then stay with me, because now there is no going back. If this was all just a figment of my imagination, why so many attempts to silence me? Why do those who should seek the truth prefer to cover it up? I know I'm dealing with something that goes far beyond what the eyes can see, something that few would dare question. But what about you? What do you think of that? Do you believe that dark pacts can actually exist within the church? Have you heard similar stories? I need to know your opinion. Leave your comment below and tell me, do you think this evidence should be revealed to the world, whatever the cost? Or are there secrets that should remain hidden? Your engagement is essential for this story to continue. Share your reflections, your doubts, and if you have already experienced something similar, don't hesitate to tell us. And remember, your every word strengthens this investigation. Now let's move on, because what comes next is even darker. I didn't know exactly what to expect when that mail reached me. The envelope was discreet, without a return address, without any clue as to its origin. Just a yellowed package, worn by time, but which seemed to carry an invisible weight. Something inside me hesitated before opening it. The feeling was similar to that of someone approaching a limit that should never be crossed. But curiosity, or perhaps a greater calling, pushed me to continue. Inside the envelope, I found a collection of old documents, papers that gave off a smell of mustiness and forgotten time. They were handwritten records, signatures of important figures in the church, but with a disturbing detail. Many of these names had already been erased from history, as if they never existed, as if someone wanted to make sure they were forgotten. My eyes scanned each line carefully, and it was then that I realized something that chilled my spine. In the midst of those texts, between passages and official records of the church, There were references to a dark agreement, a pact sealed not just between men, but with something far beyond human understanding. The writings spoke of a silent commitment, an oath of loyalty to hidden forces in exchange for power and influence. It was not a simple misconduct or a mundane scandal. It was something much deeper, something that spanned centuries and hid behind the most sacred walls of the Christian world. There were descriptions of secret meetings, ceremonies, held in hidden places, away from the public eye and even the most devout believers. Rituals that evoked mysterious forces, mentioning names that should not be pronounced. The most terrifying thing was the way the texts described such meetings as moments of great importance for the power structure within the church, as if these pacts were the true foundation that supported some of the biggest decisions and changes throughout history. At first, I doubted what I was reading. Was it possible that something like this had been happening for so long and no one had ever discovered it? But as I progressed through the documents, everything started to make sense. Many unanswered questions, many mysteries that had always hovered over certain decisions and events within the church now seemed to have an explanation. It wasn't just corruption, it wasn't just internal politics, it was something beyond that. There were records of names of priests, bishops, and even cardinals who were supposedly part of this secret circle. Some had already passed away, but others were still alive. And more than that, they still occupied positions of influence. The thought that these men could be making decisions that affected millions of believers around the world caused me indescribable discomfort. But the worst was yet to come. Among the papers, I found a specific document, more recent than the others. Unlike ancient manuscripts, this one appeared to have been written just a few decades ago. Its language was more modern, but the content was as disturbing as the previous ones. It spoke of a renewed commitment within certain religious orders, ensuring that tradition was maintained. The tradition. This word was repeated several times throughout the document, but without ever being clearly explained. However, the signs were clear. This pact was not just a relic of the past. He was still active. My heart raced. If that were true, then there was something much bigger going on behind the scenes, something most people would never imagine, and I had somehow become part of it. It was at that moment that I felt, for the first time, that I wasn't alone in the room. The silence in the room, which until then seemed ordinary, now seemed charged, dense, as if a pair of invisible eyes were watching me. I looked around, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia. But a chill ran down my spine and a strange feeling came over me. Then the phone rang. The sound was abrupt, breaking the silence in an almost deafening way. It wasn't a typical time to receive calls. Something inside me told me I shouldn't answer, but at the same time, ignoring that call seemed impossible. Hesitantly, I picked up the phone and held it to my ear. On the other end of the line, there was no answer, just a deep silence, filled with an invisible presence. I stood still, waiting, feeling my breathing become heavier by the second. And then, a voice whispered, faint, barely audible, but enough to make my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have read that." The line went dead immediately. The sound of the repetitive beeping echoed through the room like a final warning. I stood there, holding the phone with shaking hands, staring at the documents on the table. Someone knew what I was doing, and more than that, someone was watching me. I no longer had any doubts that I had stepped into forbidden territory. But what scared me even more was realizing that this was just the beginning. I continued, staring at the papers spread out on the table, trying to process everything I had just read, trying to understand what it meant for me, for the church, and for the faith that I had always defended. But something was clear. This was not a mistake. It was not a historical mistake or an unfounded theory. The documents left no doubt that within the church itself there was something hidden, something dark, a secret network that spanned centuries and that in some way remained active to this day. The evidence spoke for itself. Handwritten words, symbols that referred to ancient orders, signatures of people who, officially, should not have even existed. And more than that, the constant references to one and the same entity, a group that called itself Watchmen of the Night Guardians. The name alone carried a weight. Something about him made me uncomfortable, as if those words echoed from a distant place, a place where faith and reason no longer had power. Among the documents was a diary, or at least what was left of one. The pages were yellowed and fragile, some almost illegible, others appearing to have been torn out. But what was still possible to read was enough to make my heart race. The diary belonged to an 18th century priest, someone who had apparently tried to expose this society before. His account was astonishing. He described secret ceremonies taking place inside cathedrals at night when everyone believed the temple was empty. He mentioned chants in ancient languages, symbols engraved under altars, hidden marks in stained glass that could only be seen in a certain light. But what disturbed me most was one specific passage, highlighted in darker ink, almost as if he wanted to ensure that anyone who found that diary knew exactly what was going on. They gather when the church sleeps. They make their vows not to the Most High, but to the Prince of the world. Their eyes reflect no light, for they walk in darkness, and those who try to stop them disappear. My stomach dropped when I read that. The priest who wrote this diary seemed convinced that this society not only existed within the church, but also had direct influence over its decisions, its structure, and more than that, over its own destiny. I continued flipping through the pages, feeling like I was crossing a path of no return. It was then that I encountered something even more disturbing. On one of the papers attached to the diary was a list of names. Some were ancient, having been missing for centuries, but others were names I knew, and not just knew. They were the names of important, influential figures, men who held high positions within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, bishops, cardinals, people who had the power to define the direction of faith for millions of believers around the world. People who, if those documents were right, were part of something that should never exist within the church. My mind was spinning. How was this possible? How had no one ever discovered this before? But the truth was simple. Whoever tried to expose the truth disappeared. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to organize my thoughts. I remembered the phone call a few minutes ago, the cold voice that warned me that I shouldn't have read those papers. I was not the first to find this evidence, but would he be the next to disappear? I took a deep breath and turned my attention to the diary. The later records were even darker. The priest who wrote that began to describe signs that he was being followed, watched. He mentioned shadows that belonged to no one, noises in the cathedral's corridors, a constant presence that he couldn't explain. And then, suddenly, the diary ended, without a last note, without an explanation, as if he had been interrupted before he could finish his report. The last page had just a single word, heavily scribbled, silence. My heart raced. That priest tried to expose the truth, but he couldn't. And now, centuries later, I was on the same path. I closed the diary and looked around, feeling a strange sensation that I was no longer alone in the room. Something in the atmosphere had changed, an invisible weight, as if the darkness itself were watching me. I tried to shake off the paranoia and focused again on the documents, the Night Watchmen. This society was not just a group of conspirators within the church. They were something bigger, something more dangerous. And if the records were right, then their influence went far beyond what anyone could imagine. They didn't just infiltrate the church, they shaped the church, and somehow they did it without anyone noticing. But now I knew, now I had the proof. The question was, what would I do with them? The weight of the truth I had just discovered was still pulsing through my mind when I decided I couldn't stop there. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose pieces that needed to be connected. If this secret society, the Night's Watch, Really? Existed within the church for centuries? How did they manage to operate in the shadows without anyone stopping them? What exactly were they looking for? And perhaps most importantly, who else knew this and remained silent? I needed more proof. I needed to find people who could confirm what was written in that diary and in the documents I had in my hands. But I couldn't just show up anywhere and start asking questions. I had already felt that I was being watched, that someone knew the steps I was taking, and any wrong move could be my last. It was then that I remembered something. During my seminary years, I heard stories about priests who, when they delved too deeply into certain investigations, simply disappeared. They were just rumors, whispers exchanged between the corridors of the church, nothing official, but the truth is always hidden in the details. Some of these priests were considered rebels, men who questioned too much, who challenged certain norms and traditions without ever receiving a clear answer. Some were removed, others abruptly transferred to distant places, and some were never seen again. But there was a name that, even after so many years, still echoed in my memory. A priest who, according to reports I heard, spent years trying to warn about something dark within the church. His name was Father Ignacio Velázquez. He was a scholar of theology and history of the church, a respected man, but who suddenly disappeared without a trace. They said he had resigned, that he preferred isolation, but there was never a convincing explanation. I decided to look for him. It was not easy to find any information about him. No official records indicated where he was or whether he was still alive. But after a few calls and discreet conversations with old contacts, I discovered he had last been seen at an isolated monastery in the mountains. They said that he had chosen silence as penance, that he lived cloistered, far from the world, far from the church. I traveled there without informing anyone. The path to the monastery was long, winding, and as I got closer, I felt a growing weight on me, as if something invisible was trying to stop me from continuing. But I ignored the fear and moved on. When I arrived, I was greeted by an elderly monk with a tired but still attentive look. His name was Friar Anselmo. I explained that I needed to speak to Father Velázquez, but his expression instantly changed. He hesitated for a moment before leading me to a small stone room lit only by the dim light of a candle, and there he was. Father Velázquez was an elderly man, but his eyes held an intense flame, as if he still carried a burden that he could never share. When I mentioned the documents and the night's watch, he took a deep breath, folded his hands, and after a long silence began to speak. He confirmed everything. The Guardians existed. They always existed. They were more than a secret society. They were the true architects behind many of the most important decisions within the church. They were not just infiltrators, they were the hidden structure that supported certain circles of power. Since time immemorial, they influenced not only ecclesiastical politics, but also social movements, wars, and alliances. The scariest thing was why they did it. According to Velázquez, these pacts were not just about earthly power. They involved something much deeper and darker. The Guardians believed that spiritual influence could be manipulated, that forces beyond human understanding could be controlled to ensure the Church's supremacy over the world. And for that, they were willing to pay any price. He told me about priests who, over the centuries, tried to oppose this group, men who had their reputations destroyed, who were silenced before they could expose the truth. Some disappeared without explanation, others were accused of heresy, convicted of crimes they never committed. The pattern was always the same. Those who got too close to the secret were eliminated. I asked him if there was a way to prove all this, something that could be used to expose this hidden network of influence. He smiled sadly and just pointed to his own chest. "The truth is here," he said, but the church was never ready to listen. But then he did something unexpected. He got up with difficulty and went to a small bookshelf in the corner of the room. After a few minutes rummaging through old parchment and books, He handed me an envelope sealed with wax. "That's all I've been able to gather over the years," he said. "If you really want to go down this path, be prepared for the consequences." I took the envelope with shaking hands, feeling the invisible weight of what was inside. Before I could leave, he made one last warning. "They know you're looking, and they don't forgive the curious." I left the monastery feeling like I was being watched. The silence around me was unnatural. There was something about it that made me uneasy. When I reached my car, a shiver ran down my spine as I realized that someone had been there while I was inside the monastery. On the windshield, a note, handwritten in elegant and precise calligraphy. It simply said, "Turn back while you still can." I held the paper for a moment, feeling my heart race, but I already knew the answer. I couldn't go back. From the moment I left the monastery with that sealed envelope, something inside me changed. I knew I had crossed an invisible threshold, a point of no return. The eyes that had previously only observed me from a distance now seemed to surround me on all sides. The note on the windshield wasn't just a warning, it was a sentence. They knew I was going too deep, that I hadn't given up. And now, I was beginning to feel the weight of this decision in ways I could never have imagined. The first night after my visit to the monastery was unsettling. I went back to the small apartment where I was staying, closed all the curtains and locked the door twice. I felt paranoid, but something told me that prudence was necessary. I took the envelope that Father Velasquez handed me and placed it on the table, staring at it for long minutes before finally deciding to open it. Inside, I found a collection of pages yellowed with age. Some were excerpts from diaries, others looked like copies of confidential documents. But there was one in particular that made my stomach turn. It was a confession, a handwritten testimony from a former priest who claimed to have participated in one of the night watchman's rituals. The description was chilling. He was talking about a ceremony held in an ancient cathedral at midnight. The main altar was covered with a black cloth, and in the center was a thick leather-bound book with inscriptions in an unknown language. The air was heavy, filled with a sickening metallic smell. Participants wore dark robes, their faces covered by masks that resembled distorted human faces. They sang songs that seemed to resonate within their own souls, a sound that, according to him, could not be reproduced by normal human voices. But the most disturbing part came later. They swear an oath, not to the church, not to God, but to the one who offers power in exchange for devotion. A pact sealed not with ink, but with blood. And once in, there is no escape. My eyes ran over the words several times, trying to take in the weight of it. A priest confessing that, within the walls of the church, something so profane happened without anyone knowing. It was at that moment that I felt it. The air around me changed. The dim light from the lamp seemed to flicker for a brief moment. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I looked around. The apartment was silent, but a heavy, almost oppressive silence. My heart started to beat faster. Something wasn't right. Then came the first sound, a low noise, as if something had scratched the wood of the door. I stopped breathing for a moment, my eyes fixed on the entrance to the room. Had I imagined that? The tension made me doubt my own sanity. But then, the sound came again. This time, louder. Slow, long scratches. Someone, or something, was on the other side. Slowly, I got up from the chair, the heart hammering in the chest. Every fiber of my being told me not to come any closer, to pretend I wasn't there. But my body moved, almost by instinct. I walked to the door, feeling each step as heavy as lead. When I finally touched the doorknob, the sound stopped. Absolute silence. I waited. The air was thick. Time seemed to slow down. My hand shook slightly as I turned the key. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The hallway was empty, no sign that anyone had been there. But then my eyes went to the floor. Right in front of me lay a folded piece of paper. I slowly bent down, my heart racing with each second. I took the note and opened it carefully. And there, In fine, precise handwriting were written just 3 words: stop. Before the end, I let go of the paper immediately, as if my hands were burning. My entire body had goosebumps. How had that note gotten there? Who left him? And, most importantly, what did "before the end" mean? I went back inside the apartment, quickly locking the door behind me. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. I needed to talk to someone. I needed a human voice to remind me that I was still in the real world. But before the call went through, my cell phone turned off. Battery? No. It was fully loaded. The light blinked again. My chest tightened. This was no coincidence. From that night onwards, things only got worse. Nightmares started to haunt me every night. Vivid dreams where I saw myself walking down dark corridors, hearing whispers that came from all sides, shadows that moved quickly around me. Always the same scene: an ancient cathedral, candles melting on an altar, an invisible presence watching me. I always woke up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with the feeling that I was no longer alone in the room. But it wasn't just dreams. I heard footsteps behind me in the streets, but every time I turned around, there was no one. My computer would restart itself while I was researching the night's watch. And one day, as I was leaving the building where I was staying, I noticed a car parked on the other side of the street. The same car I had seen before, parked in different places I passed. They were watching me. The chase had begun. I was no longer just investigating a conspiracy. I had become her target. If you've made it this far, then you know this story needs to be told. And if you want me to continue exposing this truth, leave your like now. This is more important than ever for this investigation to continue. If you are as intrigued as I am, if you believe there is more to the story of the church, leave your like. I need to know that you are with me on this journey. And believe me, what comes next is even darker. My eyes burned with exhaustion. The dawn progressed slowly, but time no longer made sense to me. The dim light from the lamp cast angular shadows on the table where documents were spread out, as if each page told a story that should not be read. I knew I was risking more than my safety. He was messing with something that, for centuries, remained buried under the weight of tradition and silence. With each leaf I turned, the feeling of being watched increased. The apartment was completely silent, but I felt a presence. It wasn't paranoia, something was here, but I couldn't stop. That's when I found a thicker envelope sealed with red wax. Unlike the other documents that were loose and yellowed with time, this one still retained a certain rigor. Its edges were frayed, but the seal, despite being brittle, still bore a recognizable coat of arms, a coat of arms of the church. My hands shook as I ran my fingers over the dried seal. Something inside me screamed for me to stop, for me not to cross that line. But at that point, there was no going back. I took a deep breath and opened the envelope. Inside, a contract. It was no ordinary document. Its elaborate handwriting and the formality of the language indicated that it was something extremely important. But it was when I read the first few paragraphs that my blood ran cold. The contract, dated more than a century ago, bore the signature of a cardinal, a name that, after a quick search in the historical records I had with me, I found that it really existed. And it wasn't just any name. This man held one of the highest positions within the ecclesiastical hierarchy at the time, directly influencing papal decisions and doctrinal changes that had repercussions for generations. But the content of the document was what terrified me most. It was an agreement, a pact, sealed between this cardinal and an entity mentioned only by a symbol that was repeated in different parts of the text, a circle intertwined with an inverted cross and a set of letters that I didn't recognize. The contract detailed a grant of power. In exchange for his influence on the church's most important decisions, this cardinal would guarantee the perpetuation of a certain order within the institution. The terms were clear. The pact did not involve just one life. It was renewable, transmitted to successors, kept in absolute secrecy, protected by the shadows of a society that was committed to ensuring that this influence was never interrupted. Each clause was more disturbing than the last. Among the commitments signed by the cardinal was the promise to interfere in the choices of popes, the appointment of bishops, and the formulation of doctrines that would guide the faith of the faithful in the direction desired by this hidden force. But there was more. The contract mentioned sacrifices, and this word appeared repeatedly throughout the text. At first, I thought he was referring to personal renunciations, the giving up of earthly privileges for the sake of a greater mission. But no. The way the word was used left no doubt. These sacrifices were real. The signature at the end of the document did not belong to the cardinal alone. There was another, a signature that was not human. It was a symbol, a mark that seemed to be engraved differently than the other letters, as if it had been printed with fire on the paper. A seal that I didn't recognize, but that caused me immediate nausea as soon as my eyes fell on it. It was at that moment that I felt a strange chill run down my spine. The environment around me seemed to change, as if the air had become denser, more charged. The light from the lamp flickered. The silence became deafening. Something was here. I knew that document should not be in my hands. I knew I shouldn't be reading that, but now it was too late. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off that suffocating feeling. I took out my cell phone to take a photo of the document, but as soon as I touched the device, the screen went out. No battery. But how? It had loaded minutes before. Panic began to spread through my body. I dropped the phone on the table and picked up the contract again, scanning each line, trying to find some clue as to how it had been kept secret for so long. It was then that I noticed a detail that I hadn't noticed before. At the bottom of the document, there was a barely noticeable note written in a fainter tone of ink, as if someone had left a hidden message there, hoping that one day it would be found by someone. If you're reading this, then it's already too late. They already know who you are. I released the paper immediately, feeling a shiver run through my entire body. My breathing became heavy. The silence in the apartment felt more oppressive than ever. And then the sound came. 3 sharp knocks on the door. I remained motionless. Fear gripped every muscle in my body. 3 more beats. My heart raced. I looked at the door without having the courage to move. And then a voice on the other side, low, almost a whisper. "Father Thomas, we know what you found." The room spun around me. My stomach turned. The voice continued, cold, unhurried. "There is no escape." Silence came soon after. I remained still, unable to breathe. Time seemed to have frozen. When I finally regained control over my body, I took a hesitant step towards the door. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I put my eye on the door window, expecting to see someone there. But the hallway was empty. Opened the door, slowly. There was no one. But on the floor, right at the entrance, rested an envelope, identical to what I had encountered before. I picked it up with shaking hands, and as soon as I turned it over to see the seal, I felt my blood run cold. It was the same seal as the contract. Someone wanted to show me that I was not in control of this investigation. Someone wanted me to know I was being watched, and more than that they were already too close. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time, not having the courage to open it. My entire body felt tense, as if trapped in an invisible trap. The seal was the same as the one on the contract I had found, the same symbol that was already beginning to haunt my thoughts. Who had left this here? How did they know where I was? And more than that, what did you want to tell me now? The air inside the apartment felt heavier. Ever since I started this investigation, I felt like something was around me, a silent presence, always lurking. But now, it wasn't just a feeling, it was real. They were close. I took a deep breath and with shaking hands, broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short and direct message. "You opened the wrong door. Now, There's no closing it. A shiver ran down my spine. The handwriting was identical to the note they had left earlier. They were watching me. They knew every step I took. It was at that moment that I realized that this investigation had gone beyond the limits of the physical. I wasn't just dealing with a human conspiracy. There was something greater, something beyond understanding, something spiritual, and I needed help. In the back of my mind, a name echoed. A man who, years ago, I had briefly met and who, at the time, had struck me as somewhat eccentric, but who was extremely respected by those who understood the weight of the spiritual world. The most renowned exorcist I've ever met, Father Matteo Ricci. He was not just an expert. He was someone who had faced evil face to face. His stories were feared even among the priests themselves, because he dealt with what many preferred to ignore. I needed to find him. The journey to his monastery was long. He lived in seclusion in a remote region, a discreet place without any signage, as if he were hidden from the world. And maybe he was. When I arrived, I was greeted by a monk who, upon hearing my name, just nodded his head without showing any surprise. It was as if he already knew I was coming. He led me into a small room, lit only by candles. The smell of incense hung in the air, and the atmosphere carried a weight that I couldn't explain. And then he entered. Father Matteo was an elderly man, but his presence was intense. His gaze seemed to pierce my soul, as if he knew exactly what I had seen, what I had felt. He didn't ask why I was there. He just sat down in front of me and said, "You found something you shouldn't have." My hands were cold. I didn't know what to say. But before I could speak, he continued, "They know your name, and they have already crossed the threshold." I swallowed hard. My voice was weak. The exorcist took a deep breath, his gaze filled with a seriousness that made me feel a fear unlike anything I had ever experienced before. This was never just about men plotting for power. It was never just about the church. You have touched something that goes beyond flesh and blood. You've opened a door to something much older and much more dangerous. My heart was beating so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Who or what are they? For a moment he just watched me. Then he leaned forward slightly and said, "The Night Watchmen are not just a secret society. They are a covenant-keeping order, a pact that, over the centuries, guaranteed power and influence to those who signed it. But this power comes with a price." My mind was spinning. What kind of price? He stared at me for a moment, then said something that made my blood run cold. A price that cannot be paid only in the world of the living. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to process, but he didn't finish. This pact is not just a political or earthly power agreement. He is a spiritual covenant, an alliance with something that does not belong to this world. The weight of his words fell on me like an avalanche. I already suspected it, but now I was sure. The Night's Watch didn't just manipulate the church. They served something that required sacrifices, something that needed to be fed. Are you saying, my voice trailed off, that they made a pact with supernatural forces? The exorcist's silence was the only response I needed. My skin crawled. I knew evil existed. I knew that there were spiritual forces that tried to infiltrate where they shouldn't. But hearing it from someone like Father Matteo, a man who spent his life fighting the evil one, made it all real in a way I wasn't prepared for. He continued, "You feel it, don't you? The weight around you, the signals began. Unexplained noises, nightmares, shadows where they shouldn't be. My breathing became ragged. They are surrounding you." My mind was filled with the last few nights, the footsteps behind me, the note on the floor, the phone hanging up on its own, the invisible weight that seemed to watch me whenever I was alone. "Does this mean I'm possessed?" I asked hesitantly. The exorcist shook his head. "No, but it means you got attention, and they are trying to weaken you. First come the warnings, then come the attacks." My stomach turned. "How do I stop them?" Father Matteo suspirò. "You can't, not alone. The silence prolonged between us. Then he got up and walked over to a shelf full of ancient books and scrolls. He picked one up, leafed through it for a moment, and then handed it to me. This is one of the oldest records about the Night Watchman. It contains descriptions of the rituals, the promises, the consequences. I held the book carefully, feeling the weight of the story in my hands. What do I do now? The exorcist looked me in the eyes and said, in a low but firm tone, "You decide how far you want to go. But know one thing, Father Thomas." He approached, his eyes filled with cutting seriousness. "If it continues, you need to be prepared, because they are not just men." I swallowed hard. "They are not just a society." My heart hammered in my chest, and then he said the phrase that would echo in my mind for the next few nights. "They are servants of something that does not want to be revealed." The weight of those words hit me hard. I was no longer just dealing with documents. I was dealing with something much older, something much more dangerous. The weight of Father Matteo's words still echoed in my mind as I left the monastery. The air seemed heavier, charged with something invisible but palpable. I knew that from that moment on, my investigation was no longer just a search for historical documents or buried secrets. Now, I was dealing with something that transcended human understanding. As I drove back to my accommodation, my gaze was lost in the dim lights of the deserted road. Each shadow cast by the streetlight seemed to move subtly, as if something was creeping into the corners of the night. I knew I was being watched. On the bench next to me, the book that Father Matteo had given me remained closed, but I felt its presence as if something inside it was still alive. It contained detailed records of the Night's Watch, their rituals, their promises, and the consequences that befell those who tried to expose them. Upon reaching my destination, I locked the door and closed the curtains before finally opening the book. The first thing I noticed was how old the binding was. The pages were fragile, some already worn out by time. There were sections written in Latin, others in languages I didn't recognize, but some parts were translated in notes made in the margins, as if someone at some point had tried to decipher that forbidden knowledge. It was then that I found a name: Saint Michel Abbey. The location was mentioned repeatedly, almost as a central point of the Night's Watch operations. It was not just an ordinary monastery, but a place where, according to records, ancient rituals were performed. I had already heard about that abbey. Officially, it had been deactivated decades ago, but, according to the book, activities never completely ceased. Something was still happening inside. What made me even more uneasy were the detailed descriptions of certain ceremonies. The texts talked about midnight meetings, where members of the church's high hierarchy gathered in an underground hall to perform rituals that should never have been carried out inside a sacred place. They wore dark robes, chanted in a forgotten language, and made offerings whose details were too disturbing to describe here. But one specific section made my blood run cold. Those who seek power must first offer something in return. The pact is not symbolic, but real, and those who witness without taking part disappear. I closed the book for a moment, feeling a shiver run through my entire body. I needed to go to that abbey. That night I barely slept. The nightmares returned, but this time they weren't just fuzzy images or formless whispers. Now I saw faces, hooded faces hidden under dense shadows, moving in circles around a black altar. Their voices overlapped like a distorted echo that seemed to invade my mind. In the center of that altar, a symbol glowed reddish, pulsing as if it were alive. I woke up in a cold sweat, breathing heavily. It wasn't just a dream. I was being warned, but there was no longer any room for hesitation. The next day, I prepared for the trip to Saint Michel Abbey. The place was remote, hidden between hills and forests, as if its own geography wanted to keep the curious away. The journey was long and silent. When I finally arrived, the scene before me seemed to have come from another era. The abbey was immense, its weathered stone structure covered in vines that twined around its walls like invisible hands trying to suffocate it. The windows were broken, the wooden doors covered in deep marks, as if something had tried to rip them open. But what disturbed me most was the silence. There was no wind, no sound of birds, not even the rustling of leaves, just an absolute void. I walked slowly to the entrance. The door creaked open, as if it was resisting my presence. The interior was dark, damp. The smell of mold permeated the air. My hands shook slightly as I turned on a flashlight and made my way through the narrow hallways. The architecture of the place was strange. Despite being a place supposedly built for faith, something about it seemed off. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I felt a constant pressure in my chest, as if the air itself was thicker inside. I continued exploring until I found a flight of stairs that led underground. There, the atmosphere completely changed. The smell of incense mixed with something metallic and sickening filled the room. The stone floor was worn, but strange marks covered much of it. They were symbols, the same ones I had seen in the book. My heart sank when I realized this wasn't just an abandoned basement. It was a place of rituals. Then I saw the traces, ashes scattered across the floor, melted, candles around a stone altar that looked like it had been recently used. On it, marks of what appeared to be dried blood. Those ceremonies were not just ancient stories, they still happened. But what terrified me most was what was on the wall opposite the altar. A huge mural drawn with dark lines represented a hooded figure holding a book. Behind her, several other hooded men knelt as if in devotion, and among them, one detail made me take a step back. The faces. Some were faded beyond recognition, but others were clear, and I knew them. They were the faces of men who today held positions of influence within the church, men who appeared in interviews, who led masses in great cathedrals, men who had the respect of millions of believers, and there they were, as part of a ritual that should never exist. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My entire body was shaking. Then a sound, steps, footsteps coming from the hallway I had crossed. I was no longer alone. The sound of footsteps approached slowly, echoing through the dark and narrow corridor of the abbey. My heart was pounding inside my chest, and adrenaline took over my body. I knew I shouldn't be there, that I had crossed a dangerous threshold, a point of no return. The evidence was everywhere. The altar, the marks on the floor, the strange symbols, the mural on the wall that revealed familiar faces, men of power, men who were supposed to represent the faith, but who, by all indications, were involved in something that challenged all the morals and spirituality that the church was supposed to represent. My instinct screamed to run, but something inside me stopped me. Maybe it was the need to understand, to see with my own eyes how far this was going. Perhaps it was the conviction that the truth needed to be revealed regardless of the cost. I turned off the flashlight and hid behind one of the stone columns. The light of a lamp flickered in the hallway as the silhouette of a man was projected onto the wall. His steps were steady but controlled, as if he knew exactly where he was going. He didn't seem to be searching randomly. He was heading straight to the altar. My entire body was tense. The man stopped in front of the stone altar, and for a few seconds just stood there watching. Then he murmured something that I couldn't understand. The language was different, guttural, carrying a weight that made my spine shiver. Then something unexpected happened. The flame of the lamp he carried trembled, as if it had been blown by an invisible wind. The extinguished candles on the altar lit up again, one, by themselves. And for an instant, I saw shadows. Not normal shadows, but figures that seemed to emerge from the walls, taking shape around the altar. They were tall, distorted, their contours undefined, as if they did not completely belong to this world. They moved erratically, too fast for human eyes to follow, as if they were caught between our reality and something much worse. The man was not scared. On the contrary, he seemed to know exactly what he was doing. It was then that he spoke. He who dares to look into the abyss must be ready to be swallowed by it. My breath caught in my throat. He knew I was there. Before I could react, he turned his face towards me. His eyes met mine in the dim light, and at that moment, I felt an indescribable cold run through my body. But it wasn't a physical cold. It was something deeper, a terror that was born in the soul, a primitive instinct warning me that I was facing something that defied natural laws. There was no more time to think. Run. I came out of hiding and dashed down the hallway, hearing the hurried footsteps behind me. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. My feet slid on the damp stone floor, but I couldn't stop. If I was captured there, I knew no one would ever hear from me again. I reached the exit of the abbey and pushed the door hard, feeling the cold night air. It hit my face. Outside, the dense forest awaited me, a maze of shadows and trees that twisted in the pale moonlight. I ran without looking back. The branches cut into my skin. The vegetation seemed to want to grab me, but I continued forward. I needed to get out of there. I needed to survive. I only stopped when I finally reached my car. My hands were shaking so much that it took me a few seconds to unlock the door. When I entered and slammed the door, I locked the locks and tried to catch my breath. But then I saw something in the rearview mirror. The silhouette of the man standing at the edge of the forest, looking directly at me. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. And then, slowly, he raised one of his hands and made a gesture that froze me completely. He brought his index finger to his lips. A warning. I knew what it meant. Silence. The car's engine roared as I turned the key, and without hesitation, I sped down the deserted road. My mind was still in chaos, trying to process what had just happened. Now, I had more than documents, more than testimonies. I had seen it with my own eyes. But what would I do with this truth? Over the next few days, I struggled with this question. Every instinct inside me screamed that I needed to tell the world, reveal everything, show the evidence, expose the names, uncover this dark pact that corrupted the church from within. But fear haunted me at every step. Those who tried before me disappeared. What if I were next? The truth had a price, and I needed to decide if I was willing to pay it. The voices inside my head were fighting a constant battle. My duty as a priest was to the truth, to the faith, to those who trusted the church as a refuge. But exposing this secret meant challenging forces that I had already felt up close. Forces that seemed to belong not only to the material world. Then, the signs began. First, the anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Always the same thing. Silence. Just the sound of breathing on the other end of the line before the call ends. Then, the figures on the periphery of my field of vision. I saw them on the streets, in the reflections in shop windows, in my own bathroom mirror. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. Fatigue consumed me. Fear was a constant shadow. And then came the last warning. I woke up one night to a noise inside my room, a whisper, low and almost imperceptible. My eyes opened, and what I saw made my blood run. Cold. There was something in the corner of the room. Not a person, not a human figure, something greater, a presence that seemed to absorb the very darkness around her. When I tried to move, I realized I couldn't. My body was motionless, held down by an invisible weight. And then the voice whispered, "You've seen enough." The room became even colder, as if the air itself had been drained. "Pray, Father Thomas, because now they know you won't stop." And then, as if it were a nightmare, dissipating, the presence disappeared. Fear gripped me in a way I had never experienced before. I knew I was in danger, but I also knew that if I chose silence, all of this would continue. The decision was before me, and time to decide was running out. If you've made it this far, share this story. Don't let this truth die here. What is happening needs to be known. Share with those who need to know that something is being hidden within the church, because now, more than ever, I know they will do everything they can to stop this from coming to light. The nights that followed were unbearable. The silence that once seemed like a refuge to me was now a prison. I knew I was being watched. I felt invisible eyes at every step, at every corner, at every moment when my mind tried to find a moment of rest. But rest was something I would no longer have. Since the night I saw that figure in my room, something has changed. The fear was no longer just psychological. He had become physical, a presence that weighed on my shoulders, that accompanied my breathing, and that made every shadow cast by the dim lights seem to hide something that shouldn't be there. I knew I had moved where I shouldn't have, but now what was at stake was much bigger than my safety. It was bigger than my life. The truth I discovered was not just a conspiracy within the church. It was not just a pact of ambitious men in search of power. It was something beyond our world, something that had operated in the shadows for centuries, manipulating, shaping, controlling. The Night's Watch wasn't just a secret society. They were a channel, a link between two worlds, and those who were part of this pact were committed to something that most Christians would not even dare to imagine. The problem was that now I knew too much. And what happens to those who know too much? I couldn't afford to hesitate. I needed to act. I needed to make sure this information didn't die with me. So I made a decision. Before leaving my apartment that night, I organized all the documents I had collected. I took the records of the Abbey of Saint Michel, the contract signed by the Cardinal, Father Velasquez's notes, the transcriptions of the rituals. Every piece of evidence I found along this journey was meticulously organized. And so I sent them, not for a single destination, but for several. I sent copies to journalists, historians, and even to some people within the church itself. I knew that many would ignore it, that some would even try to cover it up, but the truth was now out there. If something happened to me, the story wouldn't die. But before leaving, I did one more thing. I placed a note next to each envelope sent, and in it, I wrote the only sentence that made sense at that moment. If I disappear, know that it was true. I closed the suitcase and left without looking back. The streets were empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. The silence around me was suffocating, as if the night itself was waiting to swallow me. I quickly walked to the car, my hands sweating as I unlocked the door. That's when I saw it. Across the street, under the dim light of a streetlight, a man watched me. He wore a dark suit, no badges, no insignia, just standing there staring at me. He didn't show any rush. He didn't try to hide. He wanted me to see him. My heart accelerated. I got into the car and started the engine. The noise filled the void of the night, but he didn't move. He just continued there, watching. And then one detail made me freeze. He smiled, but it was no ordinary smile. It was a smile from someone who already knew the outcome, from someone who was sure I would have no way out. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and sped down the street. I didn't look back. I didn't want to confirm if he was still there, but something inside me said that somehow they were already ahead of me. I drove for hours, without a defined destination. I needed time. I needed to think. I needed to understand what the next step would be. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stop. Not now, not after everything I discovered. My phone rang in the passenger seat. The display did not show a number, just the word unknown. My chest tightened. I hesitated before answering, but deep down I already knew what I would hear. The same voice, the same cold intonation, without rushing. Father Thomas, there's no point in running. I swallowed hard. My entire body was tense. The voice continued, you may have spread the information, but we are not worried about the documents. A silence lasted for a few seconds before he spoke again. What we want is you. The line went dead. I threw the phone on the bench, my breathing uncontrolled. I already knew. I wasn't just someone who found dangerous information. I was now part of the game. And this game wasn't just about land. Something much bigger was in motion. The pact I discovered was not just an agreement between men. It involved something deeper, something that existed even before the founding of the church. And now I was in the path of that power. What would happen to me? I didn't know. But I could guarantee one thing: I haven't revealed everything yet. And if something happens to me, know that there is more, much more. The question now is not whether they will find me. The question is, what happens when a priest becomes the target of forces he cannot see? And this will be the next part of the story. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has gripped you, because you feel like something much bigger is happening. And believe me, this is just the beginning. Now I need your help. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next chapters of this investigation. There is much more to be revealed, and what comes next is even more disturbing. If you followed everything until the end, comment here below. The truth needs to be revealed. I want to see who is really with me in this search for the truth. It is clear. Leave a like. This helps a lot so that this video reaches more people. What is happening cannot be silenced. And don't leave yet. The next video is already appearing on the screen now. Click and continue this investigation with me. See you there.